All right, so my talk is called Climbing Ladders or Scaling Walls. And let's go start a little bit about me. So Bruce Wang, I live in San Francisco with my wife, who's a teacher, and my daughters are 9 and 7. About 20 plus years of industry experience, mostly in B2B companies. 15 years as a software developer. I've done Java, Python, Ruby, Elixir, Golang. 10 years as an engine leader, or what I would call a humble gardener. That's from a book called Team of Teams. Was a pretty good book about leadership. A 2-time founder of startups, 1 exit and 1 failure. And then I also am a mentor and advisor on Plato, HQ, Enrich. And then I also have a personal Calendly where I meet with people here and there. All right, so really today I wanted to talk about my personal journey, and then talk about some of the engineering career models that I've seen on that journey, and then some lessons learned. So hopefully this will be good for everyone. So I'm going to start out first, kind of give you a background going way back. I mean, this dates me, but I was a student at University of Michigan from 96 to 2000. I was an intern my sophomore and junior year, so 97, 98. In 97, I was a local software company. I was an individual contributor. So if you see, the green is basically like what I did, and then the red is my title, right? And so I wanted to give you an idea of like the titles that I've had and also like what I've done, right? And so when I graduated from college, I became a software engineer at a startup called Marimba. Company size was roughly 200 with about 50 engineers, and I was just an individual contributor working on Java. I was promoted to a senior software engineer, and then I continued to work for a couple more years. And then in 2004, I co-founded a company called Twistage, and it was basically 3 of us for 2 years with no funding. And then slowly we built up the business. It never got big. So you could see that the biggest size of the company was 12. It was roughly, like 8 engineers. And then mostly what I did there was an IC, built up the original platform. We first built a P2P CDN based off BitTorrent. Then we sort of pivoted to build a video sharing site, and then pivot again to become a B2B OVP, or online video platform. And most of the time I was a developer. Even when I had a small team, I led like QA, DevOps, support. It was really only a 3-person team, and I was a pretty hands-on leader. I still was coding most of the time. So I did that for about 9 years. And then in 2013, we sold the company to Lexmark, a subdivision of Lexmark of Substance Software. And so from 2013, 2016, I worked there. I retained my title of like director of engineering, but then I actually applied to a different group and became director of cloud services, which was effectively like an entire division which owned all the different cloud services, hosted in a data center as well as like true SaaS. And so Lexmark was about 10,000 people. The software division about 2,000. There was probably 500 engineers in the software group. I don't know the exact numbers. And there I was a people leader, and purely people leader, and to only managers too. So it was manager of managers. And so you can kind of see, like, when I transitioned to Lexmark, we got acquired, and then I got an opportunity. What's really interesting is when I became a leader and I had, managed a team of 60 to 55 managers, I ran my own P&L. That was really appealing to me, is having my own profit loss, in charge of revenue and costs and sort of like that whole thing. And I owned that whole group. And so it was a really, really good opportunity for me career-wise. And that's why I sort of took that leap. And it was a big difference. I never led a team of that size before. And it was a really good opportunity. And so that's why I took it. So you could see, what that looks like. Then after that, I sort of you kind of see like start switching positions quite a bit. I left Lexmark to become CTO of a local startup in Kansas City called Brightergy. They did basically commercial solar, and they built a software platform to measure, sort of like how much solar generation, and then also get into like, temperature controls and stuff like that. And so in there, it was a 100-person company. The team was roughly 15, but eventually kind of shrunk it down to 5 engineers and 1 designer. And once again, I was a hands-on leader there. And really, when I made the transition for 2 reasons. One is Lexmark. When I was director of cloud services, it was too far removed from development, and it wasn't even in an engineering team. It was in like a services org, so. And so it was kind of too much for me, and I really wanted to get back to technology. And also the company kind of shifted its focus, and cloud wasn't a big thing anymore. So I really, I went there and joined there because I thought that could really push our cloud strategy. And there I was in Kansas City. So earlier for Lexmark, I moved to Kansas City from San Francisco. And then Sync FM was a startup based in Norway, and they wanted to start a small team in San Francisco. So it's up, and I wanted to move back. They were going to be in a kind of a cool shared space called Heavybit, and so it was a really good opportunity for me. Brightergy actually spun off to become its own business, and the founder had asked me to take on the CTO position there, but I decided to kind of switch positions at Sync. And as you can see, it was a pretty small startup. At the biggest, it was like 5 engineers and 1 support person. And once again, I was a hands-on leader there, managed the team, grew the team, hired everyone there, but then also wrote a lot of the software. And that was mostly Golang and Elixir. And then that business failed. That was my I was sort of like promoted to co-founder as a title, and we'll talk about that later. But it failed, and then I was looking for a job, and at that point it was, I was really thinking like, what should I do, right? Should I be an IC? Should I be a people leader? Interviewed at several different places, and then finally settled at a company called Packet. They did bare metal provisioning, basically an API for bare metal servers. It was a pretty good opportunity there. Going back to people leadership and focus on that. And, and this is where I've been there, like chasing the title, right? Like I was CTO, and obviously I have small companies, and I didn't know if I wanted to just go back to like engineer or IC or even just a manager. And this is an opportunity for me to get a VP title at a bigger company, and a little more well-known. It was a hardware company, but still fairly well-known. And actually Packet exited and sold to Equinix. So, it's now part of Equinix bare metal now. So it was a pretty hot startup, and I joined it, and I didn't really stay very long. I had 3 teams there, 15 engineers. And then, once again, this company was in New York, and I would have to fly there a lot. And I was like, I really want to work for like a traditional Silicon Valley startup that's raised like Series A and B from like really well-known investors. And Packet did raise from like Dell and SoftBank and stuff like that. So it wasn't like, it did raise from well-known people. But Shippo had like kind of all the credentials, right? Union Square Ventures and all that stuff. So I joined as senior director of engineering there. And there, you see like the title shift, even though the company is the same. There was already a VPE, so she was the one who hired me, and so they gave me a senior director of engineering title. And then there, I was a people leader again, and then of just ICs, right? And you can see it's about 3 teams, 10 engineers. The company size is about 200 with about 25 to 30 engineers. And then now to my present, which is director of engineering at Netflix. Netflix is roughly 10,000 people with 2,000 plus engineers. I'm a people leader and purely focused on people leadership. ICs and managers report to me. And then I have 3 teams, 1 managers, 13 engineers. One thing is like Netflix is well known for its like talent density. And I only manage pretty senior engineers. Like I think they probably be principal engineers in most places, you know, but we don't have titles. So everyone's a senior engineer. But most of the people in my team have like 10 plus years experience, right? And wide variety of experience as well. So that's kind of roughly my journey, and sort of what took me, give you a little background on what took me there. You know, Netflix should be obvious why I picked Netflix. I mean, I did 2 video startups. Netflix is a company that I really respected for a really long time, and I really wanted to see what it was like in person. And then being here and seeing the culture firsthand has been amazing for me and my experience. And what's really interesting is it's pretty rare for a lateral move from director to director, right? Because most of the time, if you come from a startup, even VPs might get a manager position at a larger company, right? And it was just really probably alignment of the stars, like what the person was looking for, my boss was looking for, and my experience was in APIs, and he wanted a person to run the API systems team. It was all ICs, not managers, that person had to lead. So if you were a traditional director at a larger company, you probably were leading only managers. And so I think I fit sort of like the profile, you know, perfectly, and why I was able to actually get a director level position there. And so, you know, it is uncommon that happens. But in this case, it happened just based on my experience and also just what I've done in the past. So, all right. So that's a little bit about my journey. And then you might ask, what's next? You know, right now I'm staying in my current company and grow my impact. And that's what I'm doing. I'm loving my job. I love my team and I love what I do. Super challenging. It's definitely the hardest, most impactful job I've ever done in my life. And so I love it. But, you know, I ask myself, you know, what happens in 3 to 5 years? Do I want to start another company? Do I want to become VP somewhere else? You know, maybe, aim for VP at Netflix, you know? Do I become a CEO of a smaller company? Do I explore IC director at Netflix? We don't have titles, but there is a kind of a secret title. Or do I aim for like working at a VC or something? And so that's something that I've actually thought about in the past because I really like advising, companies and founders. And really, it's like, I don't know. It's unclear to me right now what I really want to do. So for me, it's really about, I'm really happy where I'm at, and I'm okay. So the next part I'm going to talk about is like company models. And what I mean by company models is really like, as an engineer and you want to grow your career, what are the type of opportunities you would get at companies to do that, right? And so I'm going to give you a chart that I call YOLO to fellow. And what I mean by that, YOLO, you could probably guess what that means. And fellow is sort of this like title you get at very large companies, very well known. And you look at this spectrum, right? Sync was probably the most YOLO. Twisted and Brightergy was kind of on a little over. Pack and a Shippo were more kind of in the middle, you expect. Marimba was definitely much more traditional. Netflix is a really interesting place. It's kind of like in between YOLO and fellow, and I'll talk about that later. And then finally, there's Lexmark, which actually had like fellows. They had like people had been there for 20, 30 years, and I still remember being in a room with like 4 fellows from Lexmark, which is a super big deal. I mean, there's like a picture of all the fellows there, and it was a big deal to be like technical person who could grow and stay in that for a long time, right? And meeting with them was really cool to just like meet like these 4 fellows at Lexmark. And Lexmark spun off from IBM, and you can kind of see that model. So let me talk a little bit more deeper about this. YOLO, as you expect, it's really great for when you're starting out, takes no work to implement. That's the best part of it. It literally takes nothing to implement. I'm going to turn on the light so it's not all shadowy on me. Yeah, that doesn't look that great. Anyways, so like, you know, the problem is it just doesn't scale well, right? Like you could sort of just wing it and hire whoever you can get. And then compensation obviously is all over the board. You know, you're just sort of picking out of a hat, like, oh, I like you. What do you make? I'll give you, 5% more, or I'll give you 20% less, but I'll give you shares, right? And typical company size is 1 to 50. And then where I've worked, Twisted Sync, Brightergy were probably in this like space. And Brightergy had much more titles in the other businesses. I just mean in the technology group itself, right? So the next step after that is what I call the titles galore company. And so what this means is like you get a little bigger, you start waving titles around, you're trying to attract people. You know, you got like different titles. You might not even thought about like how you get to each title. You're just like, hey, you want to be VP? You want to be senior VP? Oh, you want to be senior engineer, principal engineer? All right, great. Roughly, I think you're there, right? And, you know, it's very flexible on what you work on. So that's good. And titles, you know, allow you to like move around, and you can potentially track people based on the titles. You know, some people want that senior engineer, principal, staff title. And that's a way that you can attract the talent. But you have effectively title inflation. And with title inflation, it basically means the titles are worthless, right? Like you can't even calibrate. You don't know the true skill levels. And, you know, the compensation, once again, is all over the board. It's sort of like based on what you have. And I think typical sizes 10 to 200 companies I worked at, Twisted Sync, Prodigy again, and then Packet, like I got a VP's title because, you know, it's like, oh yeah, I want a VP. And then it's like, okay, I'm going to hire another VP that then these VPs report to. And it was like, the titles like didn't matter as much. And you know, when I took over the engineering team, I wanted to like figure out what is the levels that we want. And how do you grow into those levels? And like, you know, how many do we have, right? And so we started like figuring it out a little bit more, which leads to kind of the more traditional thing that you hear that most startups are in is structure leveling. You know, you have thought out levels from like, you know, SWE 1 to 3, then you have tech lead and senior principal. And, you know, the compensation is pretty calibrated, right? It's based, hey, if you're in this level, you're going to make this much. And in this band, you're going to make this much. Because it's fairly standard, you're going to have a ton of examples of this one, right? And if you're an engineer in this level and you're probably in this kind of experience, then you're going to be, you're kind of going to be in a very set mode of growing, right? Now, what I think doesn't work is it doesn't really work with really senior engineers. It doesn't really handle market value well. And then a lot of times the manager and technical tracks are not clear or even muddled, right? Sometimes you'll see companies where the structured leveling, the technical lead is actually a level to get to manager, right? Which is a little weird because, you know, you really want to have split tracks. And usually teams, as they get bigger, they will start fragmenting. But based on how, you know, your team does it, you might have to, you know, being on the manager track might require you to be a tech lead, or sometimes it's a different position. And here, you know, you're going to probably see like 50 to 1,000 people. You know, Marimba and Shippo were in this world. Marimba, you know, the founders came from Sun, and so they obviously had a really set leveling structure, and it was really clear on like how to get to the levels. I don't know if it's like super clear, but like, you know, they definitely had like specific like senior, you know, software senior principal and things like that. And what's really interesting is when I got promoted to senior engineer at Marimba, a coworker of mine was, a friend of mine was like, you got to senior? And it's because at that company, senior was higher than principal, right? It was like senior or higher than staff. It was like senior staff and then, software staff and then senior. And so he was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you got senior title. I'm like, no, that's like the one after software engineer, right? And so, you know, it varies, right? And I'll talk a little bit that later. And examples of other companies, I'm pretty sure most Series A or above companies are in this world, right? The next is path to fellow, right? This is sort of like the distinguished engineer path, the like really well sought out delineated tracks between management and technical, right? And you have people like engineers that will report to like VPs. You have like engineers that are effectively at the same level as VP or SVP. And bigger companies just have to do this, right? Because you want to retain talent and you want to be able to have a clear path, right? I look at a big advantage is growth is effectively unlimited, right? Like you could be hired from intern all the way to your retirement as a fellow or senior fellow or distinguished or whatever you call it, right? But there's a big disadvantage, which is title chasing. In a big firm with really clear set levels, you're going to have a lot of title chasing, and you could potentially even have misaligned incentives. You might do stuff because you want to get that next title, you want to get that next run, right? And you'll probably see this typically in 5,000 plus companies. I worked at Lexmark, was a company that did this. And then pretty much every other huge company like Google, IBM, Oracle, any of those, Facebook, stuff like that, they're going to have very clear levels, right? And so, this is like what typically you'll see when you get to a certain size. And the last but not least is Netflix, what I call the Netflix way. I don't know what other to call it, right? Which is we don't have engineering titles. We have senior engineer, and that's it. There's nothing else. And now there is one title above called IC director, but it's pretty rare. Mostly every engineer is just called a senior software engineer, right? And we hire people with the right mix of experience, maturity. It's not necessarily just about the years, but it's just about like the maturity and like what you've been through and like kind of life experience, right? Another thing is it kind of, really combines like YOLO and fellow, where growth is really up to you because you're not worried about titles. You can sort of figure out where you want to grow. And there's a lot of freedom to the hiring manager because you kind of look for the right skill set. And compensation is really kind of figure it out to like the manager, right? I mean, we have support from talent, but it's really not based on titles. When I hire, I'm hiring in for a senior software engineer, but I look at a wide variety, right? Like every title you can think of. When I recruit, it doesn't really almost matter. It's just more matters like, is that the skill set I want, right? And then you basically comp based on that. And so there's some disadvantage actually in our model, and we're still looking to address it. There's kind of a lack of defined IC growth, right? You don't have exact like, what do I have to do to get here and here and here? There's not like a tiering, right? Which some people, like to know kind of what path they're on. There's a lack of talent mobility because almost every team is hiring for their team. It's not a centralized hiring. It's kind of hard to move people around because like, what I look for is different from what someone else looks for. You can't really transfer skills. And because you don't have a way to level people up, there's no way to be like, okay, I hired a distributed API engineer. I want to move them to like algo engineering. How do I even do that? Because algo engineering is going to hire only senior people, and API engineering is only going to hire, senior distributed engineers. So do I even have space for like a junior engineer, if you will, right? And growth could be capped. This is what's interesting is like, well, the whole reasons why we don't have titles is because compensation isn't capped. But growth potentially could be capped. I mean, this could be also because of our size, but there are cases where we lose people to Facebook or a bigger company because they have sort of more defined tiers, a higher level tier that offers impact. Have this like E6, E7 level that is like super, super high, where you have like a broad impact, and it's very clear, right? A typical size, I don't know. Like I know of Netflix, and then I know of Automatic. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of companies that follow this, and it's an interesting model. I love it. I think it's a great model, but you have to be really careful about it because if you don't do it right, it just becomes YOLO, and then it just doesn't mean anything, and so doing it right obviously really matters. So These are kind of like the different things that I've seen in my personal career. But I'm going to address the elephant in the room, right? Which is, isn't this all about just compensation? And I would say, yeah, kind of. I mean, if that's what you're looking for, yeah, like title chasing and looking at what level you want to be at, because so much of compensation is tied to titles. And you look at people leadership tracks, it's like, right, manager, senior manager, director, VP, EVP, SVP, whatever. You get paid more as you move up, right? And so a lot of what people do and companies do is all about like figuring out what the comp is, right? And if you're going to grow, aren't you going to optimize the most for comp? And I would say maybe. I mean, the climbing ladders and scaling walls example is to say, impact and things like that, which eventually leads to comp, is not always a clear road, right? It's not always a tiered structure that's very, very clean. So yes, compensation potentially is, if you're going to optimize for it, there might be a formula which you want to go for. But I would argue that that's probably not what you should be going for. And here's some lessons for your career based on sort of what I've seen as a hiring manager, as a personal engineer who's grown. This is kind of my own opinions of, I think, what you should think about. The first one is there is no one path. If someone told you there's an exact path of here's how you get to here, to here, to here, to here, they're lying to you in the sense that it's so different, right? Each company is going to have the different models, titles and stuff like that is not necessarily always aligned. And you could go all sorts of stuff. You could say, hey, I want to go technical all the way and never want to leave. But then you can jump around and kind of follow that track. You could dip your toes into management, come back, which I've seen at bigger companies. You could go into a people leader path or an accidental manager where you're a good engineer, you have all these skills, and then they're like, oh, why don't you lead a team? And then you accidentally become leading a project, leading a team. And all of a sudden you're a manager. And also you might just want to be a founder, and you like combination of being technical and people management, and you love that space of 5 to 10, 20, 100 engineers, and that's what you love. And so I wanted to say there is no one path, right? There's no one track that you can go on and it will just work. Each individual company might have a path, but from a career perspective, I think it's pretty hard to nail down one specific path that you can take. And there really isn't a formula. Second is non-technical skills are critical regardless of path. Doesn't matter if you're going to go to people leadership, you're going to go into technical leadership, your path to fellow, you're going to need a lot of skills, right? And here's the biggest misnomer. When I say communication skills, I don't mean presentation, right? I think a lot of people think, oh, I need to be good at presentation. No, not necessarily. Or I need to be outgoing. That's not what I mean. I mean, are you concise and succinct, right? Are you able to convey your ideas effectively, right? Can you listen and understand? How's your written and verbal, communication skills? There's all sorts of things you have to be really good at. And it doesn't really matter if you want to go down technical or people, this is a critical skill. Additionally, you have to have good product and business sense. You just have to, right? To be a great engineer, in my mind, you have to understand what you're building for and the business and the product. You have to understand your business model. You have to understand your cost model, right? If you don't, you're just going to miss a huge chunk of what's going on. It doesn't matter if you're people or technical. You have to be good at conflict resolution. Can you give candid feedback, right? Can you resolve conflicts effectively? Can you be a broker of conversations? Can you figure out why there's a conflict and try to break down the tasks and solve the tasks, right? There's all sorts of stuff that you have to be good at, and when you deal with a lot of people, you're going to have to be good at conflict resolution. Another one you're going to have to really good at is prioritization and focus, right? Like, how do you focus on things? How do you prioritize when you have a lot of stuff to do? How do you decide which one to do? The skill is extremely important. Doesn't matter what path you're going to take. And EQ, I think, you might think, oh, EQ is something you're born with. I don't think so. It's like, can you like listen, right? Do you have an active listening model? Do you have a learner's mindset? Are you curious? Like, can you empathize with your partners or your colleagues, right? Can you sort of like be a little more vulnerable and say, hey, maybe I don't know everything, and I can learn, right? And I don't think that's just like you're born with that skill, right? I think all humans pretty much have a learner's mindset, right? That's how we grow. So it's like, how good are you at that and using that, listening and really understanding the other side, right? That obviously helps with conflict resolution as well. But these non-technical skills are super important for your growth. Doesn't matter which track you're going to go on, right? Next one is, it's your career for sure, but your manager and the support structure of that company really matters, right? Based on what model your company employs and the structure that they have, it could really affect how you grow, right? You noticed I was like in a startup, and then I was at a super tiny company, and then I went to Lexmark. It was a gigantic company. It was a very, very big difference for me, but it also was a huge learning opportunity for me, right? And they had a great support structure. Where I even got the concept of climbing ladders versus scaling walls is from a training session at Lexmark, where they talked about the specific thing. Are you like climbing ladders, trying to hit some rung of like mythical title, or are you really like looking at opportunities to grow in different ways? You might be going down and up and down and up. And I still remember the example the VP of talent told me, where a woman who just kind of did her thing and wanted to learn and did a bunch of businesses and saw her friends, climb that ladder and then hit a peak. And then she was able to like go 2-3 rungs above because the breadth of experience she had was like amazing. I still remember that story, and that was like 8 years ago, right? And so, this really matters. Your manager really matters for your career growth, and the support structure of the company really matters, right? There's a famous saying, which is, people don't quit their companies, they quit their managers, right? And I think that's mostly true. I don't think it's always true, because there's also the company structure and how that fits in your needs, and how much support do you need in your career, right? Where are you in your career? It could be that you need that like really structured model to help you figure it out, or maybe you kind of want to be in a YOLO environment where you could do whatever, right? That really matters too, and figuring out what you need is going to be important. The other thing is, I really think you should chase impact and not titles, right? This is my personal opinion. Of course, I could say that even though I chased titles before. And surely you could do that if that's you're optimizing for compensation, prestige, whatever. But what I want to say is, like, think about the work you do and how it affects your colleagues, team, and company. Like, are you making an impact? Are you making impact on your colleagues? Are you making impact on your company? And as you do and create greater impact, typically compensation follows, right? And yes, there's a lot of things you have to do, to get noticed. But I think if you chase the impact and learning, it could be a better model than just chasing the titles, right? Are you happy at what you do? What if you're like climbing that ladder and you're just not happy, right? And you're just not satisfied with what you're working on? Could you also learn if you went into another role where you're more of a beginner, right? What if like you're a senior engineer, in UI design, but you kind of want to become a junior engineer in back-end systems, right? Like, that's a totally valid career path. I have people on my team who's like mobile engineer for like 6-7 years of their life, and then went back and distributed systems and APIs, and they're a fantastic engineer because they've seen both sides, and they've also worked at startups and they worked at big companies, right? And the titles vary so much between companies. It's really hard to calibrate and be like, okay, what title am I aiming for? Because you could be a VPE at some startup where they have title inflation, and then you try to go join a big company or a different company, it's just not going to match. So if you chase the titles, it may not work. And what's really funny is if you chase the title of a big company, you get to a certain level, sometimes startups might not want you because it's like, all right, you've been a director or VP at this huge company, and all you've done is ran like managers, and you're in the system and you're in the product process, and you don't know how to adjust. And I've seen that happen, where candidates get rejected because they're like too senior, or their title is like too high, and it's like they can't move around, right? They can't jump back down and be a hands-on engineer or hands-on leader or something like that, where sometimes a startup may need that, right? And so I think in the end, the last thought is, what are you optimizing for, right? When you're climbing ladders versus scaling walls, where you're going up and down trying to find the right foothold to get to that next run, you might be surprised where you end up.